The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Steve Paxton, your bio says that in addition to being an academic or having an academic career culminating in doctoral research with GA Cohen at Oxford, that you've also been working class. You've worked on building sites and betting shops, and you've been a t-shirt designer and been employed and self-employed. You've written a book called Unlearning Marx, and I want to welcome you to the YouTube live stream and podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to have you because your book is one of the ones that I think I'll be promoting for a long time. Just because it's a good way to get people interested in and engaged with the ideas of Karl Marx. Recently I interviewed a Marxist named Sean Sayer. Do you know who Sean Sayer is?
I do. He's an English guy, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's a critic of GA Cohen.
Yes. Yeah. I think I saw the interview actually. It's a few months ago, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start there. Who was GA Cohen and how did he influence your work? And then maybe in the second podcast for patrons, we can talk a little bit more heatedly about dialectical thinking as opposed to analytical thinking. But who was GA Cohen?
So for me, I was I like a lot of people. As I kind of became an adult, you can see there's something wrong with the world, and you start looking around for things that make sense, and you get drawn to lefty politics, and I did, and there was a lot I could see in Marx, but there was a lot that I just didn't really get with Marx. I don't think that I didn't understand it, but I just didn't agree with it really. There was also at that time, the Soviet Union was still a thing, so there was a big controversy about whether the Soviet Union was really a Marxist thing or whether Marxists should support the Soviet Union. And around the time that the Soviet Union was kind of collapsing, I picked up a copy of Cohen's book, Karl Marx Theory of History. And when I read that, that's really when I kind of came back to Marx, because it was kind of like reading this book and saying, okay, well, now you put it like that, now Marx makes sense. Now, not only does it make sense, but I can kind of agree with it. So a lot of the things that I had a bit of a problem with from other interpretations of Marx, I found that reading Cohen's work, the way he approaches Marx and the way he approaches anything really just kind of made sense to me. So then when it came time, after I graduated, it came time to look for somewhere to do a doctorate. Really, Cohen was the only person that I wanted to work with as a supervisor. So I wrote to him, and he was kind enough to take me on, and we went from there.
So what was it that Cohen said, or what was the main thrust of Cohen's interpretation of Marx that clarified Marx for you and made it easier for you to agree with Marx?
Okay, so I think in a lot of ways it wasn't so much kind of what he said, but it was his kind of general approach. So on the one hand, he's very analytical. That's his background. It's analytical philosophy. Mm-hmm. He's very committed to Marx. I mean, he grew up in a communist community in Montreal. He's a very committed Marxist, but also he's not afraid to question things. If there's something he doesn't think is right, then he's not going to kind of stand by it just because it's a Marxist thing. But I think as well, he really went straight for Marx. He didn't really talk very much about what Lenin had to say about Marx, or what Trotsky had to say about Marx, or what any of the kind of French philosophers in the 60s had to say about Marx. He didn't really seem interested in that. And actually, I think if you go straight to Marx, you get a different viewpoint than if you come through the prism of Marxist-Leninism or through Trotsky or something like that. So there was that, and there was also, I think, his focus on the theory of history, which I think that's the part of Marx that really appeals to me.
So I'm going to ask you two more questions along these lines, and then we can. Well, tell me about that theory of history, and what drives history according to Marx, maybe as interpreted through Cohen.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously with Marx, there's a lot of stuff there, and it's he wrote for 40 odd years. If you buy the Marx Engels collected works, they come to about 8 million words. So there's a lot of stuff there, and over a long career, people change over time. So there are different interpretations you can make from Marx, and they're not necessarily just because they disagree with each other. There isn't a one authentic Marx that you can look at. Mm-hmm. You can kind of take from Marx what you think suits you, and it's perfectly valid to do that, and it's perfectly valid for other people to take something else, and that doesn't mean that either of you are wrong. That just means you look at Marx in a different way, and sometimes you might look at Marx in different ways to explain different things, and that's valid as well. So Cohen's view, although it was fairly controversial at the time, I think it's pretty authentically Marxist. He just does a lot of tidying up, because there's a lot of stuff that Marx kind of leaves a little bit vague. I think we'll probably talk about class a bit later on, and that's like the obvious example. A hugely central concept to Marx, and at no point in those 40 years did he just write down what he thought about it. We've got to pick it all from all over the place. So Cohen kind of does that, and he rounds up a lot of what Marx says. And his approach to Marx's theory of history, he kind of he goes with he calls it the development thesis, and it's basically the idea that everything is driven by technological development. So humans are innovative. We invent things to make our lives easier, and largely we're rational. So when we've invented them, we use them. We don't pass up the chance to have a less crappy life. But so we use these inventions, and so technology develops, and as we develop technology, different kinds of economic structure suit encouraging that development at different stages of development. So as technology develops over the years, different kinds of social arrangements will accommodate that development. But over time, development moves on, and the social structure that you had in place before, that used to, at one point, was encouraging for development, suddenly becomes a brake on development. And so you get this clash. You either don't develop anymore, or you have to get rid of your social system. And for Cohen, he's fairly clear. Well, obviously, rationality dictates that you're going to get rid of your social system, not just stop developing technology. Mm-hmm. So we go through these phases. We go through slavery and feudalism and into capitalism, and eventually we come out the other side of capitalism into something better. And really, the Cohen takes a very I take a very structural view. Actually, I can't really blame that on Cohen. He takes a modal view as well. So he might just sometimes describe capitalism.
What's the difference between a modal view and a structural view?
So again, they're complementary. They don't have to be at loggerheads with each other. But a modal view would describe capitalism by its mode of production, whereas a structural view would describe capitalism as an economic structure, which is the collection of all the production relations, the classes which comprise it.
Would you look for the structural view by taking up like what's being produced, where it's being sold, what kinds of factories you have, more of an examination of the real material physical conditions? And the modal view would be what kinds of relations are happening within the factory, or is that the wrong way to split the difference?
I think both of those come under the modal view, actually. So the structural view is kind of simply stated is who owns what in the production process. So you, from a structural point of view, you would define a class by its members' ownership or non-ownership of productive forces. So, for example, a proletarian is someone who owns all of their own labour power, but owns no other productive forces. They don't own any means of production.
Right.
So we're used to obviously thinking of that in contrast to the bourgeoisie, who own all the means of production, but also that's in contrast. The proletarian status, when you're looking from Marx's theory of history point of view, your proletarian status structurally defined, actually that's what sets a proletarian apart from a pre-capitalist worker. So most pre-capitalist workers didn't own all of their own labour power. They might have had to work for some hours or some days a week on someone else's land, or they may have had to kind of pay certain fees, rents and that kind of thing. They certainly wouldn't have been allowed to go and work for someone else without getting a license to do that. They wouldn't have been able to kind of engage in the type of work. They didn't get free choice. They couldn't just sell their labour power to the highest bidder. Whereas a proletarian can do that. By the same token, most pre-capitalist producers would have had some claims, not what we would think of as ownership rights, but some claims over some of their means of production. Quite often their tenancy would come with some land that they could use for their own benefit, to grow their own means of subsistence, and also communal rights, things like the right to graze animals on a common, or to collect firewood from a spinney or something like that.
Right. So I think I'm getting a good understanding of the structural point of view.
So that would be, so then you would define feudalism and capitalism and things by those kind of structural considerations, which is really just who owns what. That's it. Who owns which productive forces.
Right. So in a way, the social relationships are a big part of what's structural, because the legal relationships are the structure, the political, legal.
Yeah. And often, I mean, when we say a kind of ownership is a bit of a shorthand, it means effective control, which is often the same as ownership. But sometimes if they don't coincide, then it's the effective control that's important rather than the legal ownership.
Well, let's talk about class. I sent you some questions about the concept of class. And I think for the first half of this conversation, that's going to be the most fruitful way to proceed, because I think there's a lot of confusion around class today. I just wrote a video script, which I'm going to release today, and I'm going to hopefully release the actual video tomorrow. We'll see. But the thing that's being debated a lot in the United States right now is whether or not you can have a class politics that isn't class reductionist, whether or not the idea of a class project is at odds with political struggles for, say, racial equality or gender equality.
Yeah.
And I've taken the perspective that class and, say, gender are just not the same kinds of categories, that you don't, that you're not talking about the same kind of thing. It's like comparing not apples to oranges, but like oranges to motor cars or something. It's just not. So I'm wondering, do you think that we should conceive of class in a way that would make saying, gender, race, and class a weird thing to say?
I think it is. I think it is. I actually, so I've got Unlearning Marx coming out in January, obviously, but I've also, since I finished that ages ago, I've been writing another book, and there's a chapter in there where I deal quite a lot with this issue. And I think if you look at these things historically, then if you look at the, so there's some in Unlearning Marx, and there's a lot more in this new book that I'm writing about the transition from feudalism into capitalism. And when you look at that, if you look at the demands of the rising bourgeoisie, one of their main demands was some form of equality. So obviously it kind of sounds stupid to say capitalists want equality, but actually there is something that they need equality of, and that is equality before the law and eventually equality of political participation. So obviously in really existing capitalism, these things don't, there are huge holes in this idea. But the philosophical legitimacy of overthrowing feudalism was that under the pre-capitalist systems, people's social status dictated what they could do and what kind of businesses they could be involved in, what kind of investments they could make, and that kind of thing. So there was this call for equality wasn't anything to do with kind of giving ordinary plebs like us any kind of a say in it, but there was an emerging bourgeoisie who were quite well off, but who were frustrated by the fact that the aristocracy, the nobility, the clergy all had these little kind of closed games that they weren't allowed into. And one of the things that they swept away was this idea of kind of social status and privilege, mainly for the top tiers. But what comes out of that is this kind of equality before the law. So it's part of the capitalist ideology, and I know a lot. This is quite controversial. I know there's quite a few people. I remember hearing people kind of over the summer when things were going on about Black Lives Matter and things. Various people saying that capitalism and racism are just intertwined. You can't get rid of racism without getting rid of capitalism. I think that's a really ahistorical way of looking at it. I think historically, although I'm not an idiot, I don't think capitalist countries are not racist. But the capitalist ideology that overthrew feudalism required equality of something, and what it required was equality before the law and equality of political participation. And the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, Thomas Paine, John Locke, even going through to like the utilitarians, when people talk about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, everyone is counted equally. No one counts double because they're the king or because their grandfather was the Duke of York or something. There's an equality there. So I think if you look at it like that, you can see, firstly, you can see like socialism and capitalism almost as a continuity, but they're both part of the Enlightenment project. Capitalism has to come first. Socialism obviously recognises that formal equalities before the law are not enough. Actually, what we need to share the stuff out. That's the equality that actually affects people's lives. But in terms of what you're saying about kind of race and gender, I think when people complain about the gender pay gap or about more back, the black prison population in the States or whatever, what they're doing is they are calling out capitalism's hypocrisy at not living up to its own philosophical underpinnings.
Yeah, it's a powerful way to do real politics, right?
Yeah, but when we talk about class, we all those things could be fixed under gender, race issues could be fixed under capitalism, and actually, capitalism, that's a promise that capitalism has failed to deliver on, but it's nevertheless a promise of capitalist ideology. When we talk about class, we're saying actually you can do what you like, but capitalism's never going to solve that problem. We need to move on to something else.
Right.
So. I think that in that way, they are categorically different issues. Class and other forms of inequality are categorically different.
Yeah, a while back, I had a conversation with a Marxist humanist, and he had the position that the African-American population in the United States was constituted a U.S. vanguard of the proletariat,
right?
And which, there is, I think, still a position worth examining and possibly, defending, even if it's wrong in a way, just to argue it out. But it's certainly not a crazy idea. But I was asking him why, that was particularly the case, and it did at times come down to the idea that capitalism was inherently racist, that it had that somehow that was essential to its aims, and I would definitely say that in practical terms it has always been racist.
It has, but also
but that's not the same thing as being ideologically committed.
Yeah, but also I think particularly in America, you have a different history there. So the racial tensions in America have a particular history, which is not the same as the history, for example, in the UK.
Right.
But although we have racism issues here, but the historical background of that is completely different to that in the States. But then if you look at Belgium, I don't spend a lot of time in Belgium. I kind of go through it on my way to Germany sometimes. Does Belgian capitalism have a huge problem with racism? I'm sure it has some problems with racism. Germany seems to be, a lot less. There's obviously the Scandinavian countries. There is racism there, but that's not the same scale as it is in the US.
Mm-hmm.
What about Japan? What's the level of I don't know.
I think they're pretty racist.
What I'm saying is,
my understanding as a white guy is that the Japanese are racist through and through, and they need to be deprogrammed. No,
do you see what I mean? We can get a really bad view of things because we spend all our time looking at British and American politics, and things can look hopelessly kind of forlorn. And then you go to Denmark, and they're talking about having a 20-hour week within 20 years, and they're bringing in UBI and all these. They've got a democratic electoral system. I'm not saying they're a paradise, but I'm saying they're a lot further along the line than we are, and we get caught up sometimes in the UK and the US shit show that's going on.
Right. When we do our second, more informal podcast, although this has been pretty informal, we can talk about things like UBI. That will be fun.
Yeah.
But for people who want to hear that conversation, there's the Patreon. You can support us. But what I think we agree on here is that bourgeois ideology aims at creating universality of equality before the law. That this is why projects around anti-racism, projects that emphasize disparities, have are so salient within the mainstream discourse, is because it really does speak to the ideas that dominate our society and ideas that we're falling short on. I would also dare to say that if you want to look to some success stories socially for bourgeois society or capitalism or bourgeois democracies, the struggle and the successes of women and of Black people in America and of immigrants, these are real success stories for the bourgeois society. I mean, alongside other successes like the extension of the healthy lifespan and that kind of thing. So I can imagine that if we manage to avoid another massive calamitous depression and another super world war, that we could in 100 years really have a much, much more egalitarian society than we've experienced in the 20th century and that we're experiencing today.
But I think fortunately we don't have to wait for it. It's not the case that we've got to wait for capitalism to stop being hypocritical and get to where it should be before we can have socialism, because all of those things, or those bourgeois equalities of equality before the law and political participation, they're part of socialism as well. They're just not the part. They're not the difference between socialism and capitalism. They're just, we can have those under social. We can probably get them quicker if we start addressing the economic structure and moving towards socialism. Then we're going to hit, we're going to address racism and gender issues much more quickly.
Yeah. So let's talk about class now that we kind of determined that it's not the same kind of thing as gender and race. It's not an identity, I guess. So how should we understand the idea of a class, for instance, the working class, and how did Marx conceive of the working class? And was it different than the proletariat?
I think so. Marx uses working class and proletariat reasonably interchangeably. He tends to use working class when he's being more kind of political, when he's writing pamphlets and he's making speeches. But when he's doing more kind of theoretical work about economics or about history, then he moves on to, he starts to refer to the proletariat more often. I think one of the problems with class is that everybody has a different idea about what it means. And in general discourse, when we talk about class, we often mean a collection of occupation type, whether you're manual or non-manual worker, how much you earn, what kind of car you drive, all kinds of cultural signifiers, what kind of drinks you like, and what sort of TV programs you watch and things. That doesn't, and that's a valuable way of looking at a thing. And if you want to call that thing class, then that's fine, because that's what everybody does. But that's not really what Marx means by class. And which is why I take more the structural view, which is he's kind of, I think, the most consistent approach to class, is that your class is determined by what you own or don't own in the productive process.
Right. So it's your relationship maybe to the mode of production, or the relationship to...
Yeah, well, I think it's your location in the economic structure, really, in the network of who owns what. Where do you come? And the class then is what you share with other people. If I'm a proletarian, I don't know any means of production. I have to go to work and earn money, otherwise there's no food on the table. And everybody else that's in that same boat is also a proletarian. So I think one of the problems we've had is that through kind of in the post-war period, as working class people became more affluent, there was a lot of theorizing about how, well, they're less likely to have a job in a factory, they're less likely to be blue collar, they're less likely to be at a union, more likely to have gone to university, or at least to have had some kind of post-school education. They're more likely to go and buy a washing machine or something. I mean, there was a whole argument in the 50s and 60s about whether working class people buying washing machines meant that they were going to vote Tory and saw themselves as middle class. And I think actually, when working class people buy washing machines, it's just because they want a washing machine, because actually that means you don't have to do your washing in the sink. But there was an idea that there was a stratification of class, because some wage earners were actually doing quite well for themselves. Some people's children were going to university and they were doing quite well for themselves, and other people were working down the mines or in the factories, and some people were unemployed. And the working class stopped being this kind of homogenous lump that people could say, that's the working class, they will all behave like this, they'll go on strike and they'll vote Labour and that kind of thing. And people started saying, actually this working class thing is broken up and we don't really have a working class anymore. But we definitely do still have a proletariat.
Yeah.
Most people are proletarians.
So the difference between you're making between proletariat and working class here, just in case I missed it, or I think I did miss it, is that people have washing machines, so they're not working class, but they're still proletariat because they have to get a wage to survive. Is that? Yeah,
I mean, if you don't own any of the means of production, then you need to go to work,
regardless of whether you have a house or a car or a washing machine.
Yeah, and having quite a nicely paid job as well doesn't from that point of view of Marx's structural view on things, that doesn't make you not a proletarian. The fact that you earn a decent living. From a kind of a general having a chat down the pub point of view, you might say that guy's not working class anymore. He's made it out of the working class. He's now middle class because he does these cultural things where he has these possessions. But from a structural point of view. And I think this is important kind of going forward. So I don't want to preempt your other questions, but you asked me another question about the next transformation.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think one of the big things that's going to happen, and following on this idea that it's technological change that really is the core driver of change, and everything else kind of gets moved by this kind of prime mover of technological change. The next big thing that's coming up is AI. And that's going to be completely different to every previous wave of automation that we've had. Earlier kinds of automation you had in the 19th century, we had Luddites smashing up machinery in Yorkshire, and we had swing riots where agricultural labourers were smashing up threshing machines. In the 1980s, we had a load of print workers put out of work because computers just made their entire profession redundant. And this has affected small groups and quite isolated groups and usually quite powerless groups. But AI is going to be different. It's actually, there's a lot of research at the moment that's saying that basically no one's safe from AI. the more qualifications you've got, the more vulnerable you are to your job going away to AI. There's a guy who's done some really good research where he's actually used AI to, on the one hand, look at the patents that people are applying for artificial intelligence, and on the other hand, look at job adverts and job descriptions. And this AI kind of algorithm goes through these and says, well, those jobs, here's a load of jobs that people are advertising, and here's a load of patents for machines to do those jobs. And what that's going to do is it's going to be, firstly, the scale of that change is going to be much bigger than previous kind of employment displacements via technology. And secondly, the reach of that around the population is going to be much higher. It's not going to be small isolated groups. It's going to be a huge number of people. And if you go back to the kind of the idea of a proletarian as a wage earner, even if you're earning quite a decent salary, most people are only a few weeks away. Most people can't live. Somebody who's in their mid-40s and doing quite well for themselves, if they get made unemployed tomorrow, and so do all the other people who do their job, and there just isn't a job for them anymore, their situation is not actually that different to somebody who's earning half or a third or a tenth of their income. No one can survive when you're a proletarian and you don't have means of production to live on. Once you're unemployed, then you're pretty destitute pretty quickly. People might have savings, they might have a big house, they might also have a big mortgage that they can't keep up. They might have negative equity. So I think there is potential. I'm not making a prediction here, but I'm saying this is the kind of thing that might happen. Is that when a lot of this might be something that kind of reunifies the proletarians by virtue of the fact that they are proletarians. The fact that they don't own any means of production, they don't have stocks and shares and a separate income that they can live on, means that actually when AI hits, despite some trappings of middle classness, everybody's in the same boat. Everybody's unemployed, and actually, if AI hits in the way that some people think it is, everybody's unemployable, and so they then all have a common interest in the same things. The unemployed architect has the same interest as the unemployed plumber. He needs some kind of policy that means he's going to be able to live when he's unable to earn.
So, do you think that that this will help reinvent the kind of class or proletariat, the working class that conceives of itself as being a class? Because one of my questions here was, in the 18th Brumaire, Marx defines a class as having a national bond or a common culture or a political organization, or maybe all of that. Do you think that definition of class no longer holds today? And do you think that AI will actually, the conflicts that come out of the development of artificial intelligence might actually help reconstitute that kind of class? That's a politically oriented class for itself rather than in itself.
So kind of yes and no. So yes, that's going to put a lot of people in the same position because they're going to be unemployed and potentially unemployable, and and they will have a shared interest and they will find the same policies attractive. Whether or not they then recognise that as something they have in common with each other is a different matter. So I think Marx's bit in the 18th Brumaire he does kind of contradict himself in there, because he says of the French peasantry that without a common bond and a political organisation, then they don't count as a class. But then elsewhere he says they don't have any of those things, but he still calls them a class. So I think, and that's where you get the class in itself, which is a class in itself is a group of people who you can objectively observe they have the same relationship to the means of production. A class for itself is that group of people when they've developed class consciousness and they realise they're all in the same boat, and if they act together, they can kind of make some progress as against other classes. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that the transition from capitalism to socialism will be brought about by a group of people who recognise that they have a shared class interest. I think it might be that they, because of their material position, the same course of action makes sense to them, and so they all do the same thing. whether that doesn't have to be storming the Winter Palace. That could be voting for a government for a party that promises a jobs guarantee. But that kind of move, the movement towards socialism is going to be encouraged if a load of people all find themselves having the same interest, and that interest is sharing out the means of production a bit more. At the moment, while those people are collecting high salaries and driving nice cars and living in nice houses, they don't really have any interest in changing anything. And the people that do have an interest in changing things don't have the power to do it. So maybe, mass AI-based job insecurity is something that will kind of bring a unity back to the proletariat.
What about the idea that what's needed also is a developed vanguard party that will help frame the issue when it arises, be there already prepared when the AI creates a new mass working class that's immiserated?
Well, I think it depends what you mean, I guess, by the vanguard party. So I think, yeah, if that's a bunch of people.
What do you think? You and I will be at the head of it.
Well, okay, then that's going to be a good one because that's going to work well. So I think if you've got a lot of people, and I don't know if you want to talk about this now or later, but if you've got a lot of people with good ideas about where we might go, then I think yes, yeah. I mean, there's that. Is it Milton Friedman? The only time he actually said anything that was right was, when a crisis happens, that the ideas it's all about which ideas are lying around. So
right.
We need to get these ideas out there and these ideas lying around. And you get someone like. Are you aware of Thomas Piketty, the French economist? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he obviously Capital in the 21st Century was his big kind of book, but he's written another one after that, Capital and Ideology. And I don't know if you've read that, but there's tons of stuff in there. And he's a senior French economist. His book is kind of 1,000 pages, huge volume, and it comes with a website absolutely crammed full of data to back everything up. So it's not some kind of guy who's just sat on a park bench and had an idea one day.
Yeah, I'm aware.
Piketty is kind of he's laying out in very kind of, and he's costing this stuff as well. He's costing his ideas based on a tax regime which is about the same as we had in Britain and the US between the kind of after the First World War up to the 80s. Before Thatcher and Reagan kind of rolled it all back. So it's nothing excessive. He's not going mental here. But from that, he thinks we can have a basic income. He thinks we can have, he argues for a universal capital endowment where every French citizen on their 25th birthday gets 120,000 euros. So, this is quite a big step. That means that actually, so you can maybe pay it if you can't afford to go to university. Well, somebody's given you 120,000 euros. Go to university, set up a business, do whatever it is. Just live on the money while you train for a new career or something. That's quite and his reason for that is that his big thing is that everyone concentrates too much on income being transferred. And what you need to get to the point of is transferring wealth. So he's trying to make wealth temporary by constantly recycling it to new generations. So that's the kind of, if the vanguard party means people having ideas like that, fully costed ideas that are going to transform wealth from this permanent kind of reserve of the bourgeoisie into something that's temporary but shared and enjoyed by everybody, yeah, then I can see that being a good thing. If by a vanguard party you mean kind of throwing Molotov cocktails, and I've got nothing against Molotov cocktails, I just don't think we can win.
Right. Well, listen, Steve, I think we're coming up on 40 minutes here, and we've come up with a topic that would be a very good thing to start up in the Parrot Room. But before we do, it's what I mean by the vanguard party. It would be the party that would be able to send, someone like you to Siberia for not having a firm enough grasp on value theory and all the arcana around capital. And that's what we'll take up in the parrot room, whether or not which one of us is going to get sent to the gulag after the revolution. It will be a battle. Everyone should tune in. But just to clarify what I'm joking about a little bit and give you a chance to respond before we wrap this up, this first half, I feel as though even if you had wealth redistributed through the state at the scale of $120,000 endowment for each citizen, or $1 million, that the project of creating a certain kind of value for exchange would soon enough change the value of the money itself, and would end up creating conditions where capital accumulated in a few hands, and that this mechanism wouldn't really function well enough to overcome class. That you're trying to use class and the value class produces to then overcome class.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm not offering this as a solution. What I'm saying.
All right. Well, now I've got you off the list there. You're clear.
I'm safe from the gulag. Okay. What I mean is that we need these are the kind of ideas, because a transition is not going to happen. I don't think we're going to have. I don't think we could have. I don't think it's viable to think that there's going to be some overnight seizure of the means of production. We need to move there, and we need to take people with us. And we need to, if in 10 years' time we're closer to socialism than we are now, then that's going in the right direction. Hopefully, we can go faster rather than slowly. But I'm not convinced by the idea that we have any hope whatsoever of actually having some kind of armed uprising.
If you watch American television, you know that all you need in order to take over a government is like a guy who's really good on computers, and a good-looking super soldier, and a woman to direct it all. So that's all we need, Steve. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week, and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.